I guess I'll just say what I'm going to talk about today before I open the presentation. So I'm going to present for about 20 minutes on feminism and race. And then after that, I have a list of questions that we can all go through and kind of discuss based on what people think of the presentation and what kind of people get out of the presentation. And I just want to talk about the reasons why we need to redefine feminism and kind of what the definition of feminism has been in the past, and different things that need to be included, like that marginalized groups need to be included, women of color, just that feminism needs to become intersectional. And I think also this conversation is really important right now with the Black Lives Matter protests and with the experience of Black women in relation to police brutality that really isn't talked about in the popular media. I might as well just start the presentation, I guess. So I'm going to share my screen. So my presentation is entitled How We Can All Become Intersectional Feminists. And this is because I think that the term feminist and feminism has really had a negative connotation throughout the history for a long, long time. And I think it's really important that we recognize the things that feminism has been and done in the past really doesn't have to define what feminism is right now. So I really like this quote by Angela Davis because it talks about the fact that feminism really needs to include not just the rights of one group, not just the rights of white women, which it historically has been representing, but that it also needs to further the rights of more marginalized groups and historically disenfranchised groups before we can further the rights of all people. So she really breaks down the fact that feminism should not just be talking about gender equality. And so once society begins to understand this, I think we can kind of break down what's been going on historically and what we need to change. So before we start, I asked people to watch the TED Talk, How We Can All Be Feminists, or We Shall Be Feminists, and think about your definition of feminism. So if people could just take a minute, if you didn't write anything down, and kind of try to concretely think about that. And I want people to have an idea of where they were before they see this presentation and kind of even where they were after watching the TED Talk. So I'll just give a second. And when you guys are all set, if you can just like give a thumbs up so that I can know. I can't see. Anyways, okay, I'm gonna move on. So this slide has a lot on it, but I thought that it's important to put together a timeline of intersectional feminism and kind of the feminism that you might not necessarily learn about in high school or even in college. And the movements that were going on throughout that time. So I think a lot of people, or many people probably know about the Feminine Mystique, and that Betty Friedan published this book that kind of came out after World War II when a lot of women were being forced back into the private sphere and like back into the home. She really was kind of talking about the fact that women at this time were expected to find fulfillment in a life of sexual passivity and a life of just child rearing and cooking and cleaning and going to PTA meetings. And a lot of women felt great unrest at this time, and they didn't really know how to like put a finger on it or articulate it. And she kind of answered that question and gave people the way to like galvanize the movement of the women's rights movement, essentially. Then after this, women began to organize themselves to become more political, to start lobbying, to start voting, to try to get their voice, essentially. And try to be heard and have the women's rights movement and the women's rights agenda kind of at the forefront of political ideals. And around this time, Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman to run for president, and she was the first Black congresswoman. But I think it's really important that the things that we don't talk about, and I think it's important to recognize the movements of unrest that were happening within the populations of women of color and these groups that really have been historically erased and not focused on. So Angela Davis kind of talks about this idea of glass ceiling feminism or bourgeois feminism, which is like, she talks about Hillary Clinton being kind of the figure that represents this feminism where you're at the glass ceiling already. Like all you have to do is crack the glass and you're up with the men. Whereas the groups that are not being focused on, like women of color, lesbians, immigrants, religious minorities, women with disabilities, they're not at the ceiling yet. Like, they have a lot of other barriers that they have to break through before that they can get to the ceiling. So even things that I hadn't heard of, and at this time, like, important messages came from the Combahee River Collective statement, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And a lot of books are being published talking about the relationship between Black women and feminism, and how Black women really felt like they weren't included in feminism. And this term just kind of was very negative at that time. And I wanted to bring up Audrey Lord because she was a Black feminist lesbian poet, and she was really outspoken about the fact that she had all of these different parts to her identity, and the fact that she could be privileged, but she can also be disadvantaged as a result of all of these different things. So she understood that many women who are alive, or she talks about the fact that she was privileged for her ability to have children. And there are a lot of women out there that can't have children, and she's privileged for her ability to find work and be able to make money from this work and be able to put food in her, or to feed her children. And she understood that many women who are alive don't have these luxuries. And so she's quoted for saying, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I am not free as one person of color remains chained, nor is any one of you." So she sources Malcolm X in talking about the fact that while Black women, or Black people in general, are not responsible for their oppression, we as a whole, as society, are responsible for their liberation. So we need to kind of address this. And that's when, in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw coins the term intersectionality. And this is really important because throughout all of these times beforehand, with the Combahee River Collective statement and all these other women who are publishing books or poetry, they didn't have a term to describe their feeling. And I think that really makes it this monster that you can't really fight against, because when you can't describe it, you can't do anything about it. So it's really important when she finally coined the term intersectionality. And I think it's also really important to bring up the Black Lives Matter movement in context of what we've been going through in the past few weeks, but also in the past, since 2013. Just the fact that these protests are really centered around Black men who are being murdered by police, which often leaves the Black women who are experiencing this violence and brutality to be erased and forgotten and not really talked about in the popular media. So the Combahee River Collective was a statement given by the group of Black lesbian feminists, and they kind of explained the current sentiment and how they felt about how they were being treated and what their place was in society. And they really found it very difficult to separate race from class or sex oppression, because these things they really found to be inherently linked, but were often, I mean, in policy or in front of the law, essentially, like, were not considered to be linked. So they really called for the liberation of all oppressed peoples via the destruction of our current capitalist, imperialist, and misogynistic society. So really, that just kind of like everything needs to be broken down before we can try to start over and fix anything. And I really liked this quote where they talked about the fact that they do not have racial, sexual, heterosexual, or class privilege to rely upon. So they really didn't have anything that they could use to try to help them break down these systems of oppression. So it just shows like how important it was that they came out with a statement to explain how they were feeling. And Bell Hooks was a scholar who wrote many prominent books, particularly on what we understand to be intersectionality. And I had given the option if anybody wanted to read the speech allegedly given by Sojourner Truth called "Ain't I a Woman?" So this is like, that's where the title came from. And it's essentially talking about the ideals of chivalry as they apply only to white women, that a lot of the times in her speech, she talks about how women are supposed to be put up on a pedestal and treated as if they are so dainty and special and like carried up into a chair, what is it called when you? Chariot. And so in practice, these ideas are not applied to Black women. They're really only applied to white women. And Bell Hooks talks about the fact that contemporary Black women are asked to choose between a Black movement that served primarily the interests of Black male patriarchs and a women's movement that served the interests of racist white women. So this kind of, they're not included in the narrative. They don't have a part of a group or a movement that they can join, because both these movements are really not speaking for them. So, and Bell Hooks talks about the fact that when she was raised, she really was insisting the fact that her own female identity is different because she's a Black woman, and she sees the world through a different lens because she's not white, and white women and Black women have different experiences because of this, which makes sense. And this relates to the anthology published in 1982 entitled "All the Women Are White, All the Men Are Black, but Some of Us Are Brave," just because it speaks to the fact that Black women are doubly enslaved, making it difficult for them to determine what fight they should give their time to. So I can't talk about intersectionality without talking about Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in 1989. And it was in a legal brief that she coined this term. It was on the intersection of race and sex, and the longer title is "A Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Policies." So it's really important to understand that this is a legal document because it shows the fact that the intersection between race and sex is something that is being used in court and being used to determine difference. It just, in the case that she talks about, she says that there was a lawsuit that examined a cause of action either for race discrimination or sex discrimination, but not a combination of both, which is unfair because that's completely denying the experience of Black women and saying that they can only claim one form of discrimination, even if they're experiencing both. So again, it was really important that she coined this term because it was understood and felt by women for such a long time, but they didn't know how to kind of fight against it until they were given the term for it. And before I go on to discuss the TED Talk that everybody watched, I just wanted to bring up Angela Davis, who was a Black Panther. She's an activist for the freedom of political prisoners, and she herself was imprisoned many times and understands the system from the inside as well, from being imprisoned. And so she also feels that there's an aspect of feminism that should be abolished. And she talks about, again, about glass-ceiling feminism and bourgeois feminism and how she wants no part of that. And she actually says that when she was asked a long time ago if she was a feminist, she said no. And she said, "I'm a Black revolutionary, but I'm not a feminist," because feminism didn't include her. So she wanted a new feminism that includes women of color, queer women, trans women of color, and all these other groups that historically have been marginalized. And I thought it was important to bring up a point that she made about the fact that state violence expresses itself through the military, the police, and the prison system, but then also can express itself in the bedroom, because there's the connection between seeing a police officer and seeing these public people treating women with violence, and it normalizes it, and it makes it more okay for that to happen domestically. So in the quote at the end, she's just talking about the fact that we don't want to be assimilated into misogynistic society if we say no to heteropatriarchy. So this is the TED Talk that I chose for everyone to watch. And I think it really gives a context for where the world is at right now in the way that we're treating women and kind of the way that men define feminism. And she talks about a lot of men who came up to her and tried to define feminism to her. And like one of the men said, feminists are women who are unhappy because they cannot find husbands. And she says the word feminist is so heavy with baggage, and she would have to keep adding different words in front of it to try to make sure that she was still like happy with calling herself a feminist. So she would say, "I'm a happy feminist, I'm an African feminist, I like to wear high heels, and I don't burn bras," and all these words that she felt like she needed to add beforehand. But I also thought it was really important that she brings up systems of oppression and how they can be blind to each other. Like when she talks about her Black male friend who asks her why she talks about her experience in America as a Black woman and not just as a human, which is kind of shocking because he talks about his experience as a Black man. So that's kind of him not being conscious or empathizing with the fact that she may also have a different experience because she is a Black woman. So I think it really brings up the importance of understanding that everybody has a little bit of pain living in the society, and we can't fight over who's the most disadvantaged. But instead we have to ask this person how their experience is different and try to understand their pain so we can work with them instead of not being able to work with other people. So I wanted to go back now and have people think about how their definition of feminism has changed. And I kind of included the dictionary definition of both feminism and intersectionality, how Adichie defined it, and with Alice Walker at the end, it was a definition that she came up with before the term for intersectionality came out. And she said, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. And a womanist is more conscious of issues than race and gender. So womanist kind of was a little bit more intersectional than feminist. If anyone wants to put in the chat like their definition or maybe how it's changed, I can't actually see the chat right now, but it would be cool to see if anybody has changed their ideas throughout this presentation. And I also wanted to include this slide because I personally was appalled when I was researching Black transgender women and the experience that they have in the United States. And when you simply Google even just Black trans women, all of the articles that come up on the first Google page are about murder and all these horrible injustices against human life. And I think that should not be the narrative for trans women either. And that the coverage of Black trans women is really only in the context of violence. And obviously it's important and we need to recognize that as well because they're also not being focused on in the popular media and the conversations of the Black Lives Matter movement. But the narrative should also include the accomplishments and movements that they enact while they're alive. So I wanted to talk about, I think it's hard if I'm giving a lot of kind of frustrating and depressing information if I don't give context or a plan for people in the future. Not that I'm any authority or not that I know really either, but I think it's good that we talk about it. And I think it's really important that we recognize that Black women and girls are as worthy of outrage in relation to police brutality. And we really need to be talking about them too and talking about their names instead of just saying the names of Black men who've been victims of police brutality. And again, here's Audrey Lord, and she would begin a lot of her poems and essays, maybe all of them, I don't want to misspeak, but she would say Black lesbian mother warrior poet, which is kind of the examples of all the different pieces of her and all of the different parts of her identity. And so it just shows like no one is just one thing. We all have a lot of different parts of our identity. And so she's quoted saying, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, which I think is just like saying a lot of the things like the Constitution that we have, just because they've been around for a long time doesn't mean that they're good necessarily, and doesn't mean that we need to continue to follow the laws and rules that we've written down. So if we want to dismantle the society that we're living in or the master's house, we have to really break it down instead of just trying to take apart one little piece and change one little thing. And we can't look at it from a one-sided approach. We have to look at all the different systems of oppression. And I wanted to make this slide again because I think the narrative is so streamlined to only talk about Black men. And when I was looking at this list, the only name that I knew was Breonna Taylor. And I think that's, I don't want to assume, but I think that's probably true for a lot of other people too. There are a lot of Black men's names that have become household names, and I'm not trying to delegitimize the importance of remembering everyone's names, but I think it's necessary that we address the fact that people don't really know the names that are on this list, and that's a lot of names. So now I want to move on to the discussion portion. I know I just like threw a lot of information at everyone, and you might need a second to process, but I have a list of some questions. So I don't really want to keep sharing my screen, so I can just like put them all as a suggestion in the chat, and we can like pick what we want to say from it, or you can just kind of say what you felt from this presentation, whichever people want to do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Go ahead.
All right. I'm Stephanie Shanakan, and I'm so proud of Jackie right now. Good job, Jackie. I am thrilled to see everyone here, and I particularly love this topic because I think it's a topic that we need. I think that this is the moment. It's such a timely topic because I think so many people are getting sort of turned on to the issue of racism, and we're striking now while the iron is hot, and I feel like Jackie just really picked on a topic that that needs to be talked about right now. So I wanted to maybe answer a part of your first question, Jackie, which is how do I define feminism? And for me, watching that video again of Chimamanda Adichie was something, because I'm also Nigerian and I'm also Black, right? And I could understand all the references that she was putting out. And so for me, I picked up on something that she was saying, which is that feminism is, we want to say that it's culturally based, right? That it depends on your culture, it depends on where you live, it depends on who you are, how you're raised. But I think what she does in that video is raise some sort of fundamental global principles about who we are as human beings. And so I kind of struggle with this idea of, you know, is it culturally specific or is it more of a global term? And I wonder what other people think. I think in many ways it's cultural. You know, I think in many ways as a Nigerian, as someone who was raised Nigerian in West Africa, that, you know, there are certain etiquettes about how I dress or how I deal with my marriage and so on. And yet my children, who are all born here in the United States, I have 2 daughters and a son, and they think quite differently about these roles. So I kind of, and yet neither of us is wrong, but I don't think I need to throw out mine to kind of allow for a sort of more Western, a Western definition of feminism. So I'm kind of in the middle then. I wonder what other people think, where other people were born, or how you've all evolved. Even you, Jackie, I mean, how you've evolved in your definitions of what feminism is.
I can respond to that. I think I had jotted down a little definition of what I thought feminism was after watching the video earlier, and just like 2 minutes before this presentation. And then after hearing what you have to say and also watching the presentation through, part of my definition said that there's an unequal, or that genders are treated unequally. And then I attributed most of that to European and colonized worlds. And I think that that's a very like maybe American perception and maybe white American perception of me to take, because I think that there are many different cultural like stigmas against different genders throughout the world, and it plays in different ways. And I think, you know, most of the world is under some kind of patriarchal, culture. And so I think that, you know, that feminism can be a global concept that people latch onto. And then obviously in each local community, there are going to be different areas. So thanks, Jackie, for opening my eyes to that a little bit too.
Yeah, Lainey and Stephanie, I appreciate, you know, the thoughts that you brought up. I'm just thinking about my own experiences, and I like how you brought up that it was, you know, or can be really culturally specific. Like for me, although I was born in India and moved here when I was young, I am still very privileged in certain ways compared to family that is still in India. You know, I have friends back there who, like this one's a little bit of a personal story for me, but she wasn't able to be brought to a hospital without the presence of a man. It just wasn't allowed. She wasn't allowed to leave the house. And I could never imagine that happening to me here. And as a result, she wasn't able to get, you know, medical attention and ultimately passed away due to sepsis. But I think that, you know, we kind of in countries like the US, we can kind of take for granted, you know, or at least I can take for granted certain privileges that I have here that not every woman is afforded around the world. Not only, and now that I'm thinking about it and processing it, it's not just in places like India. Like that is a very like stark example of people not being able to get access to healthcare because they're women. But even, you know, Jackie and I were in a race policy and public health course 2 semesters ago where, you know, you look at the kind of care that Black women and Black trans women get in healthcare here. And so many times people are denied access to life-saving medication or pain medication because of the color of their skin and, you know, healthcare workers' perception of their pain and their bodies and, you know, kind of the medicalization of race. And so this is really like getting the ball rolling and making me think about like, how is, you know, feminism defined and how does it, I feel like it's so different to each person depending on their, you know, background and culture. And, you know, sometimes it's been really reduced and people are like, oh, like, you know, blah, 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 feminism. And people kind of like look at, you know, women like, oh, they're just complaining, oh, they're just doing this without really understanding like the structural and institutional discrimination that has led to so much loss of life. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
I can go, I guess. Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say that, and also an interesting tie for like feminism and culture is also the role of religion. In my Spanish class, we talked a lot about how religion has an impact and how that strongly defines like the gender roles and between like men and women. So that plays a big role, like that I've seen, especially in strong religious societies, especially in the Middle East and strongly Catholic societies. So I think that like religion is also like an important like factor to consider too. And also, yeah, watching the video, I learned a lot on how women are perceived like around the world. I guess in Nigeria, for them, it's more of like a caretaking role. And it's interesting to see, like, especially if like women and men, she brings up an example in the video of a man and a woman who have the same degree, but the woman is confined to still doing the household chores. So it's interesting, like still, it's kind of innate, you know, like it's, you could still see it ingrained in society. So I just thought that was also an interesting point. It's like, regardless, even if you have like master's or PhD degree or as have the same job as your like spouse, like you're still like doing those household work, taking care of the children. So
hi, my name's Sarah, and I feel like I can speak to my experience that I think my definition of feminism has changed because of a cultural thing or because of my cultural experience. So I feel like I hesitate to define myself as a feminist in America, and especially like in the Northeast, which is where I'm from, because it is so quickly aligned with this kind of like white feminism that is now a pejorative term. And honestly, it should be, because it, you know, kind of represents that second wave that Jackie was talking about, where it was mostly white women who were advocating for their own rights and not taking like a holistic perspective and looking at other types of identities that affect people. But I think in other countries where, you know, we think of gender parity as being really lacking, maybe Nigeria, like we were talking about, or maybe Saudi Arabia as being the worst example, where it was only very recently that women were even allowed to drive. Being a feminist is a very radical idea, and it's almost an act of like civil disobedience to acknowledge yourself as that. But I feel like in my context of being here in the US, to say that I'm a feminist feels like to ignore other issues that are going on at the same time. It feels like to say I'm more worried about my own well-being and my own perceived depression than, you know, other types of identities that are struggling. So I feel like I more tend to align myself by saying like, well, I'm social justice oriented, or like, I really like the womanist term. I know it's not used as much, but yeah. So I think culturally, you know, as a white person in like the very liberal Northeast, to say that you're a feminist does kind of arouse this idea of being selfish a little bit, and very like Eurocentric.
And that makes me wonder, like, do we have to get rid of the term feminist, or like, is there any way to possibly redefine this term, or has it been too kind of tainted throughout everything that's happened?
Hi, I'm Izzy. I mean, I think the word feminism is, like Sarah was saying, it's just become sort of something that doesn't accurately represent the needs of, I would really say, most of the world. Even though maybe that's not the intention of it, it's what it's become. And I think for me, after living in many different countries, I've sort of come to understand that, like, I've let my ethnocentrism get in the way of my definition of feminism, and that it's, for me, like, I grapple with, you know, going somewhere and looking at a society and the way people live and saying that's wrong, but not being the one to actually experience it, and sort of to like grapple with colonizing almost people's other struggles that is not really mine to maybe understand. And I think from that, I've realized that like Sarah used the example of Saudi Arabia, and I think it's a really good example because people, I've seen so many articles of people saying, the burqa is, chains, it's prison, when in reality, it's a symbol of freedom for so many people. And when I lived in France, some people were saying, oh, we don't need feminism here. We are a very equal European society, and that may be true for white women. But many of my Black friends in France whose families are from Africa do not experience that, and especially, and the burqa is actually banned in France. So I think, for me, it's just more about like reining in my own cultural perceptions and my own experiences, and letting, if it's about someone else's culture, let that culture speak for themselves, I guess.
I think this is really interesting, especially your question about does that mean the word needs to be retired? Because I think that my definition of feminism, and this may be because growing up and throughout college and graduate school, I was taught Black feminist politics, but with an understanding that like that is a type of feminism. Therefore, I can say when I say I'm a Black feminist, there is this misunderstanding of the idea of I'm a Black woman who's a feminist, like Black as in describing my race, as in Black as in describing feminism and that set of politics. And so I feel like I've kind of moved over time to, instead of thinking of feminism as a label, thinking of feminism as a way of life, kind of, that ability to advocate for others, that ability to like look at policy, look at cultural differences and cultural oppressions, and say that my feminism comes from a place of the fact that I identify as a woman. And so I am looking through the lens of a woman at this particular situation. And even if the situation is not understood to be based in gender, it is my Black feminist politics that are reinforcing and changing the way I'm viewing this. And so I think it's interesting because I think like, talking to my mother and being like, yeah, I'm a feminist, she was like, why in the world would you call yourself that? You know what I mean? And with this understanding of feminism as a very fraught term, and talking about white feminism, white women's feminism of the second wave, which was very, very fraught is the nicest way we can kind of define that. And so I don't know, I think it's interesting because I think like oftentimes we are thinking about the label and the connotation so much that we may not talk about like, well, what do feminists do? And I think all feminists do things differently because all people are different. And the way that I practice my Black feminism may be fundamentally different than another Black feminist woman. And so a part of me is kind of like, no, we don't need to get rid of the term. We just need to like make more nuanced understanding of it. And then another part of me is like, honestly, the term doesn't matter, the politics do. And I feel like that's the primary tension that I've been at for like a few years now. So yeah.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about feminism being more of an act than a label. I think that as people, we kind of strive for labels. I think that we, in a certain sense, people like to have labels when it comes to certain things to kind of, you know, identify who they are and what they believe. But when it comes down to it, calling yourself a feminist doesn't actually progress the notions of feminism at all. It is just a label. It's not truly an identity unless you live those actions. But then again, based on Audrey Lord and how she would list all of her identities using those as labels, Black, lesbian, mother, all of those things are an essential part of who she is. And I think that when it comes to being a woman and when it comes to being a feminist, you can't detach those identities. And so therefore feminism has to be all encompassing, it has to be inclusionary, and it has to be intersectional, because none of us are just women. We all have all of these other identities that come with their own struggles or their own benefits, their own privileges. And I think that feminism, like as a fight for equality, really needs to be inclusive of all of those things, or else the whole message of women are equal to men gets diluted if it then goes into white women and Black women and all of those things. All women have to be fighting for this inclusionary title. And yeah, I definitely agree that it needs to be a way of life as well.
So I don't know if, I think it's because we're hosting, we can see the hands. I don't know if anybody else can. So we're gonna do this in order of how I saw hands. Dr. Shonigan, then Anusha, and then Jackie.
Well, Jackie's in charge, so I don't know if I can go before Jackie.
No, I was clapping about what Sarah said. I wasn't raising my hand.
So I like this question that we're moving towards, this question of the very title. And I love what I think it was raised by Sarah, and then we started to take this on. And Lena's point about being a Black feminist, which, you know, a lot of the people we read, a lot of the people that scholars like Lena have read call themselves Black feminists. But I like the distinction between the Black feminist who is Black and the Black feminist who is sort of doing her work under the umbrella of Black feminism. But I was wondering about this term as well. Since we've been home for the COVID crisis, I've done a lot of walking around the neighborhood, at least the one that I live in. And right now I'm in Missouri. So, you know, it's quite an interesting mix. It's a college town. So it's an interesting mix of liberals and conservatives and so on. And I find it very interesting that, you know, as I walk around, I see a lot of Black Lives Matter signs outside, right? And they've been popping up in the last few weeks. More and more have been popping up. But I noticed that if there's a Black Lives Matter sign out in the yard, there is no American flag. If there's an American flag out in the yard, there is no Black Lives Matter sign. And honestly, it does not fail. If you see a flag, there's not going to be a Black Lives Matter sign. And so I started noticing it and making note of all the houses that had one or the other. And I was talking to my husband about this, and I was thinking, you know, why can't you love Black Lives Matter, that concept, and also have a flag? You know, like, why can't we reclaim the flag,
Okay, I guess I can go. I was gonna answer the question of like the definition of feminism. I actually took a women's studies course in my first semester, and I actually like took a lot away from it because feminism may have like different meanings and different groups. So I learned that like there's like the liberal feminists who want like equality, like equal pay, equal health care, and all that sort. And then there's like radical feminists who want to like change the system up and make like, instead of having a patriarchy, have it as a matriarchy. And there's also like the people, I think the socialist feminism who that is more of like, I don't want to say similar to liberal, but they're kind of like a little more in between liberal and radical feminism. So I noticed that like, because the term feminism, like I know quite a bit of people are mentioning it, like has some sort of negative connotation to it because they associate those people who protest and want to change the system up to like female power. So there's like those different tiers and types of feminism out there. So I thought that was interesting, like how like in colleges and in our textbooks, they try to like bring more awareness to that and like distinguish the different levels of feminism. So to me, like feminism is just trying to achieve equality, and then like those three tiers is what like feminism is to me. And then I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Anusha. I'm also one of the Race and American Story Fellows. So.
Madeline, go ahead. Hi, I'm Madeline. I'm here with my dad and grandparents and stepmother also listening in, and we've really enjoyed this whole conversation, so they're here just to tell you. But I just wanted to, I had something to add about, I really liked what you were saying, Jackie, about glass ceiling feminism in your talk, and relating that to kind of reclaiming the word feminism, which that whole discussion is something I haven't honestly thought about, because I'm really lucky to be raised in a very white and very privileged household and family where like feminism has always been a really positive in my life, and it's never been like my cousins and aunts are all like totally proud to be feminists, and more I think we're all learning to recognize that there are problems like historically and problems in the way that we have practiced feminism and thought about feminism. And so we're all like continuing to learn about that. And I liked considering it as glass ceiling feminism, where it's like people who are already at the top, like want to break through that ceiling, but like, what about everyone else who's like nowhere near there? And I'd heard one interesting thing about how like a good way to make feminism actually cover the needs of like all women, not just the women at the top, and not just sort of like the second wave feminism and white feminism that don't take into account more like oppressed women specifically, and like marginalized women within just all women who are oppressed because they're women. And just the idea that like all sorts of oppression are actually like intertied. And just sort of that like
issues of like housing and healthcare and like food security, those are like women's issues. Like we think of those just being like people, you know, those affect everybody, and they do, but like housing can affect like domestic abuse victims. Like if you could just be able to easily like get housing and not depend on like the man who is abusing you for your food and like housing and everything, if you could just be able to go and remove yourself from that situation. Like a lot of women are forced to stay because there's not like good access to like affordable or even free housing, and just that women are like the caretakers, are the mothers, and so like putting food on the table and taking care of the children and just healthcare, like those are actually women's issues. And so I think if feminism could expand to focus on those issues from a women's perspective, it would like allow more marginalized people and people of color to participate, and like I feel that feminism addresses their issues too, and then it's not just addressing like the busting through the glass ceiling kind of thing.
Jacqueline, I think this really goes with your last two questions about like, now that we have this term intersectionality and we understand, like it's helped us identify what went awry or what was wrong with the glass ceiling feminism, second wave like white feminism, like what does having intersectionality now do? You know what I mean? Like, and I think this is really interesting because I think intersectionality as its own term has kind of taken a life of its own. And when like reading Kimberly Crenshaw, she's talking about intersecting systems of oppression. And we've kind of internalized that as, well, because this oppression is about who we are as people, now we're thinking about intersectional identities. And I think what that has pushed us all to do is like be much more empathetic and sympathetic to those around us. And like to be able to say, I may not experience this type of oppression, but because I know that all oppressions are like involved with one another, then I can kind of I can't understand as in like feel it myself, but I can kind of recognize what else may be happening here. And I think that that means like kind of intersectional feminism did kind of rebrand feminism. Instead of becoming a type of feminism, nowadays when you hear people say I'm a feminist, especially if it's a woman of color, especially if it's normally like a woman of color, like in academia, it's kind of assumed it's intersectional feminism, which I think is really interesting. Because I think we can definitely tell like in different generations that you say feminism, you say I'm a feminist in one year, it is fundamentally different than saying I'm a feminist in another year. So I think like your last two questions, like now that we have a term to describe intersectionality, what has that done? I think I would answer that as like it's kind of pushed feminism to kind of take stock of itself and like made all of us rethink how oppression works and how it influences each of us individually, but also kind of collectively. And so I really liked those last couple of questions.
Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, I sort of feel like the dinosaur in the room, having been at the beginning of feminism. In other words, you know, being in college in the early 70s, being excited when Kate Millett came to speak and whatnot. But I think having read Americana and really loved that book by Adichie, I really think what for me feminism sort of I would love to see is to lose the immediate negative response to the word when it's mentioned. And also, I think, as everybody has sort of alluded to, is to really be taken equally. And I think that's even what she was saying in the TED Talk, that why do you need to constantly have to defend yourself and justify why you've accomplished things or why people should accept your credibility as a woman. If you've accomplished things, you know, we should all be put on a level playing field. So I think for me, that's what I would really like to see feminism really taking on the mantle. And I think for me, this was an education about intersectionality, but I think that really is probably a very powerful unifying force, because it sort of ends, as somebody went through the different types of feminism they were taught, it gives you a common ground and appreciation of where everyone is coming from. So I guess you could say progress has been made, but unfortunately there's still a terribly long road ahead of us in order to continue leveling the playing field. I thought it was very indicative when you talked about the American flags and the Black Lives Matter. To my mind, what came up immediately, and I don't want to get off the track, is how it took people so long to recognize what Colin Kaepernick was talking about was not the American flag at all. It was justice. It was equality for everyone. And so I guess what I would like to just leave is just that feminism really loses this pejorative context that you have to defend yourself if people perceive you as a feminist, and that women are able to really band together and work more effectively to really, and to create equality for everyone, regardless of gender or sexual persuasion or race. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, Madeline?
So this is actually Adam. I'm Madeline's father, and I couldn't resist weighing in. So I consider myself a feminist, have since college when I took a feminism class, and it was definitely a unique perspective on that I didn't get from any other course. So, you know, for me, the 3 issues that sorry, I couldn't sit here and hear all these amazing perspectives without feeling strongly about these issues. One is, if not feminism, I mean, I know other people have appropriated it for various causes, but if not feminism, what would you say to encompass the issues of, for me, that women's perspective are different, but not, you know, there's obviously differences between individuals, but overall, there is a different perspective, and that perspective is equal, if not, you know, better in many cases. So for instance, right now, COVID, if you look at the countries that have done best at controlling this pandemic, 4 of the 5 countries that have done superbly are run by women. 4 of the 5 worst countries in the world are run by men. So, you know, I think that there's something unique and special about a different perspective, not the same perspective. And then the other issue that for me is so important, because it affects my daughter and my wife, and my mother who's here as well, is, you know, we have never passed an equal rights amendment. So you can't discriminate against, you know, people on the basis of race or religion or what have you, but you can. The Constitution does not protect women. It is just something that was never passed. This country never got that far. And so that worries me. And the fact that we live in a time when we are not having a female president, this country was not ready for a female president. That's why Hillary Clinton didn't get elected. So I just think that the issues are, if not feminism, I'm all about taking that term back, because if not that, then what do you use to define the belief that these issues are important, that they have, you know, meaning for people, that people could get behind and organize. So that's my perspective.
I was just going to say, I think that this conversation benefits a lot from people of different generations chiming in. So it's really nice to see you guys and you too, Barbara, like talking about this. And that's really cool. I guess, and this is kind of encompassed in Jackie's questions, but I wanted to pose a question to you all and tie this discussion more explicitly back to what's going on right now. And something that intersectionality talks about is that the experience of, well, the way that Kimberly Crenshaw wrote about it was that the experience of Black women is greater than the discrimination experienced by racism and sexism. It's greater than the sum of its parts, basically. And so my question is, why in this moment is George Floyd a household name and not so much Breonna Taylor? Why do Black women and trans Black women especially struggle so much to get the attention of the media and politicians when we're talking about this fight for racial justice? Is it just a matter of the sum of their discrimination is too great that we're not ready to take on those issues yet, or we're more prone to publicize, you know, the deaths of men because they're more valued in society? And I also think there's like a class element that's coming on here. If we like understand that, you know, Michelle Obama moves through her life differently than Breonna Taylor did, but that's a different conversation. So I guess I was just wondering, watching all of this unfold, knowing what you guys do about this topic, what is your take on why it is that people like Breonna Taylor struggle to be talked about as much?
I mean, I love that question. I'd be happy to weigh in if I can. I know time is against us and I've spoken already too much, but I love that question. I think it's a question that really is at the heart of Jackie's, this topic. And I think that, and of course I loved hearing from both Barbara and Madeline's dad. What's your name, sir? Hold on.
Sorry, it's Adam.
What's that? Adam, okay. So as Adam was speaking, I was thinking about all the men, Black men and white men that I know, that I'm close to, who would call themselves feminists as well. And I was thinking about how I sometimes wonder how when they're on their own, you know, when they're with other men, you know, in the locker rooms, whether they, you know, and this is my husband as well, you know, I'm not trying to call you out, Adam, but I think that it's the same conversation that we have with anti-racism, right? Like we can be in a classroom, be in a room with white students and white colleagues, faculty members, and, you know, we're all gung-ho, but then what happens when you're around the table or when you're around in the locker rooms? And so when we think about this question that Sarah has raised about why we hear more about George Floyd than we do about Breonna Taylor or Rekia Boyd or Sandra Bland or any of those women, the question is, or the answer is that most times when we hear about those women, it's Black women that carry that banner. It is not Black men. It is not, you know, Black Lives Matter was created by Black women, queer Black women, right? And so Black women are really, and this, I'm so excited for Jackie's next session, because Black women are always at the bottom of the totem pole at all times. And yet it is Black women that have pushed this country forward. You know, if we think about Bree Newsom, who brought the Confederate flag down, that was a Black woman. And now we're seeing all these monuments come down. And so it is a fundamental question about why it is we are still, when Black women, and I know I walk around that campus at UMass as a Black woman, you know, and I'm in rooms with people who are not Black, and I'm always, if there's ever a question about what's happening on campus, or, you know, or the N-word was talked up on campus, it is always me or another Black woman who steps up and says something. So I think there's something about the need to start sharing that burden, you know, to hear from people like the artists that Jackie's going to talk about next time, and having that, and I think that's the moment we're in now, right? Where we are seeing more people carry the burden than just Black women, and I'm not even talking about Black men, but Black women. Yeah, Black men are the ones that get called to CNN, they get called to speak up and so on. Yet it's Black women behind the scenes that do the work. So I think I would encourage everyone, to and it's something I talk to my son and my husband about, like, what are you saying when you're out there because my son is an athlete, with your fellow athletes, what are you saying there? And I say that to everyone. So it's just I just wanted to say how excited I am to hear it and to see it, and to encourage it to keep going in other circles.
Yeah, Izzy?
I love that. And also just going back to Sarah's question, I think it also goes back to a slide Jackie had on like the public and private sphere of violence. I think violence has been so normalized against Black women all over the world. I think against women in general. Which one of you who hasn't heard catcalling before? It's something that is so much ingrained into our society that we don't see it as appalling as when someone who is supposed to have power, even if it's a Black man, is hurt and killed. It's almost like we expect Black women, especially Black trans women, to be injured and to have oppression against them that is violent. And I think that's really at one of the roots of why Breonna Taylor's murderers haven't been arrested. It's become such a, I see it all around me. I had the privilege of getting to learn from the National Homeless Coalition in DC, and I spoke to many, many women who are homeless, not from their own choices, but from systemic issues, a lot of which is domestic violence. And one of the things that they said was that, they would go to the police 10, 20 times, and it was only when their lives were literally in the balance that something was done and that they were able to go somewhere else. So I just think it's become very normalized. And yes, what Stephanie just said, yes. I heard Dr. Shanakan, yes, that's retweet. Okay.
Madeline? So
I'm not trying to hog the time, but my wife, who is Brazilian, reminded me that I'm a psychiatrist. One of the things I try to battle against is suicide. And she reminded me, because this is something we've spoken about, that the least likely in society, in the US, the population least likely to commit suicide are African-American women. They almost never do. So the rates go up dramatically for white men, then African-American men, then white women. But African-American women just sort of hug the bottom of the thing, which I think is an indication of how African-American women really are sort of this source of strength in the face of utter adversity. And, as Dr. Shonikan was mentioning, kind of the people who are behind the scenes, but holding, things together in a very meaningful way. So my Brazilian wife wanted me to mention that.
Barbara?
Also, I think just the circumstances of their deaths might be one unfortunate explanation. Breonna Taylor was just murdered in her bed. They busted into her house and the guy just went berserk. And we're so glued to social media that, George Floyd, you had so much video footage of the act being done. Now, why it was more effective in his instance than for Eric Garner in New York City, I can't tell you, but I just think, unfortunately, some of it is the circumstances. Even with Sandra Bland, that took place, no one was recording anything. So I think it was, and I guess people had said that a lot of the footage you see of the George Floyd event was someone had put together all the different videos that people had taken at the scene. So I just think, unfortunately, it's probably circumstance that sort of placed him in the forefront, unfortunately, because what happened to Breonna Taylor is an unconscionable thing. I mean, she was totally defenseless. You know, she never knew what hit her. I mean, it's unbelievable. So that's just, you know, a speculation. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's really interesting you brought that up, Barbara, because I think historically, Black women's violence against Black women has been a very private sphere, localized thing. And when it does happen out in public, there are normally these flashes of, like, you know, absolutely outrage. For instance, at the protests when a pregnant woman was brutalized by the police, like, there was absolutely a lot of outrage about that. But you're right that a lot of the names that we would put in the conversation with George Floyd, it happens behind closed doors. And I think that's because historically in the US, violence against Black women has happened behind closed doors with an understanding of anonymity and just, you know, a lack of justice, a lack of truth-finding expedition afterwards. And so I think it's really important and really interesting that you pointed that out, because I think you're absolutely right. There's something about, as much as I really dislike seeing video of Black people dying, there is something about the fact that how it has galvanized, I think, a lot of the world, and we don't get that with Black women. I also don't think I could mentally or emotionally handle it if we did get it with Black women. So part of me is kind of thankful that I don't have to see that as well as what we have to see right now. But I think the fact that it took this long with video evidence for people to understand that there was, like, conclusive long-term damage being done to Black men without video evidence. Where are the opportunities for Black women to be like, this is a problem, see it, understand it, but you can't see it? So yeah.
Andy?
In that same thread, I think it's really important for us to address the biases that are within our own bodies and minds as well. Like, I actively try to learn about these topics and put myself in the shoes of communities who so often face this type of oppression. And my eyes were really opened, and I kind of recognized my own bias through this conversation and the presentation you had done earlier, Jackie, about how, you know, Black men's names and deaths are constantly portrayed in the media. And so to me, you know, whenever I think about violence surrounding Black Lives Matter, the people who come to my head are, you know, people like George Floyd and Eric Garner. And, you know, I ask myself, why don't I immediately think of people like Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor? Why don't I know more names of women, you know, like, and I'm almost like disappointed in myself for not putting in that work to, it's not that the data isn't there. It's not that that women aren't being killed or trans women aren't being targeted. It's that maybe I'm not recognizing that within myself and going forward and searching for that information myself rather than waiting for it to be presented to me. Like, it reminds me a lot of the conversation that's surrounding Black Lives Matter. Like, it's not enough to just not be racist. Like, you have to actively be anti-racist. And going back to something you said earlier, Sarah, like, you need to put the work into it in all aspects of your life. You need to do the work. And in the same way, I'm realizing, you know, this is something that I'm really passionate about. I have considered myself a feminist for such a long time, ever since I understood what that word meant. And yet I still find myself being like, wow, okay, I didn't, recognize where that kind of misunderstanding or unaddressed bias lied within me as well. And so like going back to that question of how can we address intersectionality and move forward in, promoting that kind of intersectional feminism, I think a big part of it is a lot of self-introspection and how do we think about things and how can we broaden our perspectives and do that work.
So I don't want to cut anyone off if anyone has anything else to say, but we have gone overtime. So I'll let everybody go. But I just wanted to thank everyone so much for coming, especially on Father's Day. Happy Father's Day, Adam, because I did not realize that that was what today was when I scheduled this. Obviously now I know, but I realized that that is a little problematic. So I did want to bring up that my next session is going to be a discussion of Beyonce and Taylor Swift and their positions in the music industry through watching the documentaries on Netflix about each one of them respectively. So I hope that everybody will come, and I'll send out an email when it gets closer to that date with links of things to watch beforehand and to continue the conversation.
Can I just really quickly ask Jackie if you can, like as an add-on, this recent J. Cole No Name situation, which I think is really an interesting way to think about Black men and their misogynoir, as it's called, So I think that might be an interesting add-on.
That's true.
J. Cole's new song, Snow on the Bluff.
Yeah, and No Name just released a new song in response, I believe. Yeah, so I can add that as well. And I also just wanted to urge everyone to please talk about this topic with your family, with anybody that you see on the street, if you can talk to anyone, because it's important that we talk about this together. But I think if you don't bring it to other parts of your life, it's not gonna spread it to everybody in the world. But on that note, everybody can go and celebrate Father's Day.
Great job, Jackie. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.